Hello, Maria. Welcome to the show.
Hello, it's so nice to see you. Thank you for having me as a guest. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I'm very curious and I'm looking forward to this after a very deep exploration call we had already. Um,
Yeah.
the inner work of facilitators and where we're coming from, literally.
Yes.
So let's start right there. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
So I call myself different things depending where I am. Originally, I started calling myself a mediator.
Mm,
I was a counsellor, a mediator, and facilitator, and trainer, and supervisor, and then speaker. And there's just so many different roles that I just prefer to think of myself as someone who makes good relationships with people, out of which some change might happen.
mm, beautiful. Yeah, the because it's not only about the relationship, but it's about the impact
Mm,
we create the possibility for through these relationships.
absolutely. That there is the dialogue, and there's a time for connection, there's a time for talking, there's a time for processing, and then there's a time to for everyone to be as good as their word.
Mm, yeah, the implementation.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe the most difficult part that we tend to forget the Monday after, right? When we have left and everyone else goes back to work.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yes, and the follow up and what's our as a facilitator, what is our responsibility to follow up? What is our responsibility to hold accountability or not?
Yeah. And so, what has inspired you to go a step from the mediation towards the facilitation, which is kind of different work, I have the impression, where mediation, correct me if I'm wrong, is more about helping two parties to better understand each other. And that's about it. Where facilitation is goes beyond the understanding to the action.
So mediation generally, I mean, the word has been hijacked
Mm,
to mean two people who are experiencing some kind of dispute, which may be sitting within a contract law or a divorce or just, relationship issues, who come together and are attempting to make agreements. And in mediation, the disputants, the people participating, make the agreements, not the mediator.
hmm
So there are a lot of facilitation skills. But the issue with mediation for me was that with mediation, it's a reactive process. Somebody has to have picked a fight with somebody for there to be a mediation in the first place.
mm,
And when I first started doing this work, I was doing neighbour disputes in social housing.
mm.
Um, and it always occurred to me, even from really early on when I was just kind of learning, it occurred to me, but surely there's a way for people to speak to each other before this has happened, that this is still a reactive process. There's nothing proactive in it. And that was the shift I wanted to make, which then meant facilitation was a better way forward because it doesn't have to be any kind of incident.
Mm. I love that. Yes, and it makes so much sense. And then it's more the preventative work to help parties
Yeah,
understand.
preventative and building understanding and connection and understanding each other so that we can make allowances for each other because we're all human and all of those things that you actually, what we want. Okay, I'll speak for myself. What I want is a situation where groups, whether they're in workplaces or it's the golf club or, or the religion or whatever, where people gather, realize the value of having an ongoing conversation that's facilitated. because things shift and change. You know, you can make policies and procedures, and you can have governance, and you can have all of those things. But if we're not talking to each other, are these things serving us? So, I mean, you know, one of the things that really troubles me is, you know, we make rules and laws and policies to serve life. But when life starts serving the rules, we're in the wrong place. You know, and when you encounter somebody who says, well, I can't let you do that because the rule says, and it makes absolutely no sense. It has no humanity in it.
Yeah, and then we become the means to an end instead of being the end.
Yeah.
And one thing just tickled my curiosity when I listened to you is, and you gave a few examples. You spoke about the golf club, the church, maybe the workplace, maybe you haven't, and the neighborhood disputes. And this made me realize that most of the time when we have groups coming together that we facilitate, they kind of have a common denominator. So or they belong to the same religion, or they're working for the same employer, or they're going to the same golf club. Neighborhood is something that we kind of choose, sometimes not, but we definitely don't choose our neighbors, or we rarely choose the neighborhood because of the people. And still we have to get along.
Yes. And when you're in social housing, you have
You don't
very
have
little
choice.
choice, very little choice. And when you are put in a situation where you're living, you know, the walls are very thin, and you've got somebody 6 feet that way, 6 feet that way, 6 feet that way, and 6 feet that way, we build pressure cookers. You know, people are allocated their housing. The quality of a build is a whole, I mean, we could do a whole podcast on the quality of housing, you know. And then we don't provide spaces for people to come together and find out who their neighbours are. And I remember a thing that I did. There's a particular, we call them housing estates. There's a particular housing estate in America, they call them the projects, where the police had given up, like they weren't going there anymore. And I did a lot of work. And one of the things I did was I did a meet your neighbours event, like a speed dating event. And it was amazing, just to give people 3 minutes to talk to someone as the, you know, the outer circle moves round and the inner circle sits. And there was this young guy, you know, we're a typical hoodie guy, young kid. And he said at the end, when we were doing a mop up about the event, he said, you know, to tell the truth, as I was looking ahead and I saw this very old lady wearing her burqa and everything, he said, I was dreading it and thinking, what am I going to have to say to her? And, you know, and then he said, but when I got to her, she was so lovely. And then some of the older people said, it was amazing to meet these young people, because when they walk across the estate, we're frightened of them. And now it's like, God, I don't have to be frightened anymore.
What a beautiful example.
Yeah, it was lovely. It was such a lovely thing to do.
Yeah. And what does it take to really facilitate this encounter? Because I can imagine there's some work before. How do you, it starts with the invitation.
Absolutely.
If you put a piece of paper in the hallways, nobody will show up. So what does it take to really get the diversity of the neighborhood in there and to make them understand the value? And then how do you create the space where people actually do open up?
So that's a really, really good question. So I can sort of talk about that from that project level, and then also how I see things. And one of the things I learned, because I did a lot of work with gangs, and one of the things I learned is that trust building, there is no shortcut to trust building. There is no marketing campaign. no funding thing you can do, that you can bribe people, of course, but to get true connection, true trust, there is no, you can't speed that up. It goes at the pace of the people involved. And so you have to show up, and then you have to say things, and then you have to act in the manner, you have to model what you say. And you have to make commitments to people, and they have to see you keep those commitments. And so one of the things that we did in this particular instance was I had a group of people from that estate who came and did training. It's because I don't want to be a person that's parachuted into other people's problems. Where I am now is I want to give those skills within workplaces or neighbourhoods or prisons. You know, I want to give the skills to people and then hold their hand while they dare to try. So we trained a group of people who lived in there, lived with those problems, and then they went door to door. They literally went door to door, and they used the tool I invented is called the dialogue roadmap to engage people. And I think we had about 48 people show up to that event.
So what is the dialogue roadmap about? And I hope that I don't forget all the other threads that I wanted to pick up. Your work with gangs, very important. Dialogue roadmap.
So I've always been interested in how we communicate, and in my time I've been a terrible communicator. I have done communication by ultimatum. That was probably one of my trademarks. And then as I got older in life, I started to be much more interested in the responses that I would get from people, and who I was and what I was. And there's quite a lot of history there, like growing up being very powerless in poverty in the slums of London, to immigrant parents, to making my way out of all of that through entrepreneurship, and then becoming the boss, and then by the time I was 28, I was running my own advertising agency, and then going from and I know it's all pathetic because it was a little agency with a few people, but in my world I went from being the powerless to the powerful.
And a few people. That's so, please don't make it small.
And being the powerful was not satisfying either. It wasn't satisfying. So I got very interested in all this stuff and looking for answers. I couldn't tell you then that I was looking for healing, but I was looking for answers, right? So I discovered, this community mediation. I discovered Marshall Rosenberg's work in nonviolent communication, and I got particularly interested in the basis of his work, which is needs-based theory. And then I also discovered Reiki healing, which is, energy that doesn't have words. And isn't that an amazing thing, that maybe we could communicate with less words better? And so I had this idea that what would happen if you took the very practical steps of mediation. So in mediation, it's very practical. And you combine that with the emotional work of the nonviolent communication, the needs-based theory. You decide to take a different view of humanity and the philosophy of nonviolence. And then you also put that through a spiritual channel, an energetic channel. Like, I felt there would be a very powerful cocktail. And my outing with that, if you want to talk about, I don't know, would I do it again? I don't know, but my outing of this kind of idea I had was the gangs around where I live. And I discovered, there's a lot of history there. A 7-year-old girl was fatally shot. There were a lot of parents of children who'd been murdered, either by guns or by knives. there was a movement happening on the ground. There were people trying to come together, and I stumbled upon this, and I stumbled upon some people who were very connected in the gang world, because like where I live was like there were drive-by shootings every day. I mean, you can kind of look this up in the papers in my area, but you know, and I just felt that maybe I had something to offer. You know, some maybe looking back, maybe it was complete stupidity. But what I did was I left my house on a daily basis, and I just talked to people on the street. And of course, you know, sometimes most people think you're crazy and they cross the road. But, you know, one in every so many are going to actually talk to you or engage. So I had a job to work out how to keep people in the conversation, how to make the conversation irresistible. I wasn't selling them anything. So I was really clear this was not a sales pitch. It was genuine human inquiry. So firstly, how do you keep people in? And then I realised that all those years I'd spent in advertising, actually where I'd been sort of beating myself up for wasting half my life doing meaningless work, I suddenly realised, oh my God, that, you know, there's something in that I could draw on. So keeping people in the conversation, but then also, what is the missing ingredient to not get into a debate or an argument with somebody? Because our tendency in conversations is you speak and I reply, and you speak and I reply, and you speak and I reply, and then at some point I turn it round and I speak and you reply. And we actually use a model of conversation that is based in debate, because that's all we've ever been taught. And I started to realise another key ingredient, you know, if you're talking to people who can turn on you, is never having an agenda for another human being. So how do I keep you in the conversation? How do I show you very quickly that I'm not selling you anything and I don't want anything from you? I'm literally looking for connection and understanding and partnership. And then how do I prove to you that I'm not trying to convert you to my faith, or, you know, that there isn't some other thing that's going to come up and I've got an agenda for you to tell you how you can be a better person.
And thank you for sharing that. And I have so many light bulbs kind of popping up. And one of them is the realization of the privilege that I grew up with, that knowing there are conversations that are purely for connection or intellectual entertainment. Because I think if you're growing up in a neighborhood or in an environment context where it is about primal survival, it's a luxury to have these kind of conversations.
So we did a training. I'm just a bit of an aside, and I'll come back. But you just reminded me. We did a training in a prison, and we had a group of prisoners. And at the end of their, I think it was 6 days back then, we did a sort of, you know, what have you got out of this? And one of the guys said, "I never thought I'd be having a conversation about how to have a conversation." And another person said, "I never knew that you could fix an argument through talking." And I just
instead of the fists. Yeah.
I never knew that you could sort out an argument through talking.
Yeah, because it requires, I think, an upbringing in a certain, with a certain level of education to experience that and to know how it could be like, and also to have someone being interested in you as a being and what you have to bring to the world that is not your money or your vote.
Yes, you're taking me right back to that particular project, because I remember I remember running this training and, you know, not knowing who was coming on it. And I'd done a couple of talks and a few people had been interested, and two people showed up to the training, and they were a mother and a son who hadn't spoken to each other for 3 years. And nobody warned me that that was what was going to happen. And then there was so much poverty. I mean, so much poverty that the biggest reason that most people came to talks and trainings was because of the food and the hospitality, and they knew there would be leftover food that they could take home to their children.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a whole nother world where people are coming because they know there'll be a couple of pizzas they can take home.
Yeah.
And so that, again, you know, so how am I going to make this interesting enough that it goes beyond the pizza?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And before getting there, I would be curious in the step before. So you're talking to people in the streets, and early in our conversation, you mentioned that it's all about trust, and there's no shortcut to trust. And when I even observe myself walking through the street, if I get stopped by someone, in the very most cases, I have a prejudice in my head that they either want my money or my signature or my time for something. And I rush through. So how do you create the trust then to at least have your pitch, in air quotes, to enroll them in this conversation, to connect, although they don't know you, because this is an instant where you can win or lose their trust, or at least their curiosity.
So at that stage, it's nothing to do with trust. At that stage, it's an engagement. Is there something of interest to me that's also of interest to you?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, everybody knew at that time that there were these drive-by shootings. And so to be able to say, I'm trying, you know, I know you might not have the time or you might not be interested, but if you are interested, I'm trying to figure out what is going on in this neighbourhood. Is that something you're interested in?
Yeah.
And then occasionally, as I said, you would get people that they are interested in it because it's affecting them too.
Yeah. Okay.
And that exercise led me to a man who was later to become a dear friend of mine. Unfortunately, he died during COVID, but we were a very unusual pair. Me, a kind of, well, more than middle-aged white woman, and him, a very large Nigerian man who knew all about the gangs of London and knew everything that was going on, and but a man with a heart. So he was two people. He would not take prisoners. He did not take prisoners. He was very direct. He knew, because he knew that what's at stake is people being killed. And on the other hand, he had a really huge heart to make sure that the young people didn't go down the road that he went down. That was this amazing combination. And it took me 18 months to get his trust, because he was convinced I was undercover police. He was absolutely convinced that I was undercover police, and it took 18 months. And but when we finally bonded, it was solid. It was absolutely solid. And he was the key, because what happened was I said, look, I want to talk to you about this whole other way, this dialogue roadmap, the mediation, this whole other way that your people could be speaking to each other, ways of negotiating so people don't have to kill each other. And when he was finally persuaded that he might like to spend some time on this, he said, for every hour I spend having to learn your stuff, you have to come with me and see what I'm dealing with. So can you imagine that? Can you imagine that?
And I can imagine that it's been very rewarding on both sides, that you learn
It was,
about each other's work for each other's work.
do you know, it's a real exercise, because what I learned from him, because he introduced me to people who are, the phrase is, on the road, who have nothing to lose. And what I learned from him was truly how not to judge anybody. Like truly, you know, we can intellectually say we're non-judgmental and all, but I learned truly not to judge anyone.
And what does it take? Because this was also one of the notes I took. You get these people, you get your neighbors into the space, groups that apparently haven't learned that you can bond or deal with conflict with words. Gangs. What happens internally? What kind of inner work, air quotes, do you have to do to not to be scared, not to put them in the box, not to judge?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So what I've concluded, so I'm now with the power of hindsight. So with the power of hindsight, what I've learned is every time I sit down with another human being, I'm sitting down with a part of myself. So what I see in others is just a reflection. So all those judgments, you know, oh, this person's a nasty piece of work, that's just a part of me that I haven't dealt with. So the inner work, as I can say now from this place, and not saying like, oh, I'm all healed now, you know, you know, it's an ongoing, never ending. But the inner work is looking at the parts of myself that I don't love as much as I would like to love, and bringing myself to, and as you do that, you love others. So that's, and then externally, it's remembering that everything has a context. You can't deal or talk about an incident without understanding the context. And that's the criticism I have of the criminal justice system, is that, you know, you kind of go, well, you stole that or broke that or hurt that or whatever, but it doesn't look at the context and the societal responsibilities we have. Yeah. So, you know, so I could talk about somebody that took a man's life, but when I look at the context, he had an abusive mother. He begged to go in a children's home. When he went to a children's home, the staff sexually abused him. He then gets thrown out of all of that and into addictions. It's a trajectory. Now, nobody is saying, and he is saying, nobody deserved to lose their life because of it. But you can understand that these things went unchecked and undealt with. And that's where we end up when we don't care for and look after and note. So he has great remorse for what he did, and yet and of course this person needs to be removed from society. But what are we doing when we remove people from society? What are we doing with them? How are we helping them to come back from a place of healing and understanding and consciousness?
Yeah. And are we coming from a place of revenge and punishment, or reintegration and compassion?
Yes, because the only alternative, and some countries do it, is just murder, you know, execute people. Okay, well then let's just execute everyone who does something wrong. But we don't do that, because so we do have some humanity somewhere.
Yeah.
Let's build on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I thank you for going there. I'm and sharing your passion. What came to my mind when I heard you speaking about that every person you encounter and are in conversation with is actually a mirror to yourself. And this reminds me of the sentence that everyone can be your teacher, and brings a totally new depth to that. Because yes, they can be your teacher, but not necessarily about content or something, but about yourself.
Exactly.
So they
Yes.
help you
How
to
I
see.
react.
Mhm.
How I react to what is going on is what teaches me.
Yeah.
And how painful I want to make that because of my resistances.
Yeah. And then the willingness to really go there and to look at our trigger, to own our triggers.
To own the triggers that are reminding us of the bits of ourselves that we don't love.
Oh, yeah. And you spoke about the work also in prisons, and the topic of safety comes up. We always speak about psychological safety, so there's also physical safety. But when we look at the topic of psychological safety, when we work with groups and when we invite them to dialogue, to meet their neighbors, it implies a certain level of vulnerability to show up. And then how do you do that in an environment where trust is not a given? Many didn't grow up with trust, and psychological safety isn't a norm because, and I'm just assuming, I have no experience, that any vulnerability can be used for manipulation or threatening or whatsoever.
Yeah, it's a really interesting and good question. And by the way, when you said thank you for going there, thank you for being willing to take these risks of conversation with me.
Mm.
So one of the things about the dialogue roadmap, or one of the things that I like to do in relationship, is develop a sensitivity to the other person's tolerances. And one of the things we don't do is take anyone beyond their tolerances. So having no agenda for another human being means that what we're looking at is what's the best we can manage.
Ourselves with our own capacity and capabilities.
Yeah, and then as a group.
Mm-hmm.
Or as a family, I've done a lot of family work in my time, extended family, and I bring people in for dialogue circles, I call them. And often there's someone or a couple of people in the family who are trying to drive the family to be better. Wanting better from everyone. And there's a reality about maybe this is the best we can manage. So maybe it isn't about driving everyone to be better, but accepting our starting point first.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Because I guess, so they can be the illusion of acceptance. You can say, okay, are we all agreeing that? And then really accepting it. So how does it go beyond the written rules or the...
So when I work with needs-based theory,
Mhm.
which is, it's a well-documented, process or whatever, or theory.
Can you give us the synopsis for those who might not be familiar with nonviolent communication and need-based theory?
Yeah, so needs-based theory works on the understanding that as humans, every action we take is to meet a need. So, and the actions that we take are simply strategies to try and satisfy that need. So it's very interesting that, we all have a need for air and oxygen. And what's the one strategy we use to meet our need for oxygen?
We breathe.
And how many arguments do we have over breathing? Because we all know it's the only one. But if I took a need for respect How many ways are there to believe that we're meeting needs for respect? Think of all the cultural differences. Think of my own pain or whatever, or all the difference that we have highlighted in our society. And how many different ways are there to meet a need for respect?
The different interpretations, the different preferences, language, hierarchy, culture.
And how many arguments do we have over meeting a need for respect?
Because we always, when we say you don't respect me, we assume to understand the definition of respect.
Yes. And in some cultures, when an older person speaks, a respect is to make eye contact. And in other cultures, if an elder speaks to you, you must not make eye contact. So think about just the simple confusion, let alone the complexities of this. So when I'm working with needs-based theory, it doesn't matter to me whether you're black, white, purple, green, those things, how you want to identify is not what's important. What's important is what is the injury, loss, or harm that you are either inflicting on others or on the receiving end of. So the measurement is what is the injury, loss, or harm, and then is it real or perceived? We use that measurement. You don't need any other measurements. And is hurt feelings injury, loss, or harm? It's a good question.
And a hurt feeling can be perceived as a harm or an injury.
Could be, but that makes a great dialogue, because now if it's a hurt feeling, maybe the dialogue is about intentions and what needs we were trying to meet or not meet. But then I can look at real world injury, loss, or harm, or the prevention of injury, loss, or harm.
Because then it's also about, through words or behaviors, what wounds does it reopen, or trauma does it trigger?
Yeah, what's the impact? So that's the way in which I'm working, is I'm using needs-based theory. I'm using the measurement of injury, loss, or harm as how we can figure out, what needs to be healed, what needs to be repaired, what actions need to be taken. And then, if there is injury, loss, or harm that we can tangibly agree on, then we want a timed, measurable action plan.
So that everyone walks out with knowing what happens next and what they're responsible or accountable for.
And in my world, that isn't just a lame apology.
So what is it then?
So for me, an apology, for an apology to be real, it has to have two elements: true expressions of regret or remorse, authentic expressions, which we can sense energetically. And secondly, it has to result in some change, tangible change. We've all been involved in our families or workplaces or relationships with, that person that does it over and over again. And I'm sorry, I promise I won't do it again. I'm sorry. But if that doesn't come with change, the apology is empty. In fact, what we're all colluding in a cover-up to keep things the same way.
Yeah. And what is the outcome of an empty apology, or how do you maintain? Because I think then the trust in the system and the process comes from seeing the benefits and the outcomes, and also trusting that if there's no outcome or people do not fulfill their responsibilities, then it can backfire very quickly, I guess. So what
Yes,
happens
and
if it
so we
doesn't?
built that in. We built that in. That did a very simple neighbour mediation years and years and years ago. And one of the agreements was, I'll bring the dog in from the garden by 8 p.m. every day, so the dog's not barking at 10 o'clock at night. One of the jobs is to test the feasibility of an agreement and to have a contingency. These are really important things. So the question was, isn't that wonderful? You're going to bring the dog in every day by 8 o'clock latest. What happens when the bus is late or you fell over or whatever and it's 10 past 8? What's going to happen then? Because that is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do?
And because I think this is very interesting, and we all have, even at a lower stakes, these kind of neighborhood disagreements, or even with our. So there is no legal way to enforce that.
Well,
So
that's another story which I'll come on to around social justice, but staying here. So I would simply ask, when it's 10 past 8 and you say to the guy who's been, annoyed by the dog barking or whatever, he says 10 past 8, because that is going to happen.
mm-hmm.
What are you going to do? And you watch a person go, well, I'm going to phone him up and, whatever. And I'm like, okay, so what you want to do is phone him up. Have you even got his phone number? Is that something he's willing to share? Okay, so you've got the phone number now. He's given you the phone number. Okay. If you were to pick the phone up to tell him that it's 10 past 8 and he's not meeting the terms of his agreement, and I look to the other guy and say, what words would you like to hear that would encourage you to be okay with getting that phone call, or so that when you see his number come up, you don't just delete the call?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the kind of level that I get into. Is so the guy says, well, I'd say this and that. Would you be happy to hear those words?
I love that, because
Well, if he said it like that, it would be okay.
So to facilitate the implementation.
Yeah, at a level of precision.
Yeah.
And then you see, when you've done that, and when you have those agreements and there's been an energetic connection, you don't get to that until there's been an energy in the room that you sense, we're ready for this now. And you can clearly see who couldn't keep the agreement. You've got proper data to come back.
Yeah. And I can see that once you have been engaged in such a planning dialogue, that it becomes very difficult then to not to stick to it.
Because you spoke it, you gave your word.
You
Nobody
created
imposed it on you. I never told you to do it. You could have said, I don't care, my dog's going to stay out there barking till midnight every day. Do what you want. You could have said that, but you didn't. You made an offer because you recognised the other person's need for peace. And in recognising that need for peace, you have a need for peace too. That's where empathy comes from, recognising the needs.
Yeah. And the similarity of needs in this makes us human, and hence connect to each other.
Just the recognition that when you say you want respect, and I unpack that, what does respect mean to you? I recognise that because I want it too.
Yeah.
It was funny because this guy that I referred to earlier, didn't take prisoners and, whatever. And he and I became, very close friends and mentors to each other and all sorts of things. When I asked him what he'd got out of this association and doing this work and all the rest of it, what he said was, you've taught me how to feel again. I stopped feeling And what I've realised is when you stop feeling, that's when you can hurt other people.
Mm. And it's safe not to feel.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic way of creating safety. It's not a sustainable way.
Although looking around, I think the majority has somehow lost or forgotten how to really feel.
But we do that in our schools.
Yeah.
In our mainstream school systems, we don't want children to feel. We want nice, compliant children who get stars on a star chart, who are manipulated into good behaviours and punished for bad behaviours. And we use soft language like consequences and poor decisions to cover up that actually you need to come here and just be a nice, compliant, obedient child.
And then by rediscovering or reintroducing the language to express our needs, because also our needs then are not offensive or intrusive towards someone else. Just because I need something, I don't expect you to do something with it, and I don't expect you to have the same needs. So it's very personal.
Yeah, and you know, it's my responsibility from once I become an adult, it's my responsibility to get my needs met. The chances are, because we're not islands, getting my needs met is going to require me making requests of other people. I'm
And I
probably
think
not going to get through life getting my needs met. I mean, you know, if I want to drink a pint of milk, there was a huge amount of people meeting my need through, you know, milking cows somewhere that I don't know, you know, to get that milk onto the shop shelf that I could go and buy it. I mean, so, you know, we're collaborating and interdependent, you know, being interdependent all the time. And we don't take time to recognise it. You know, the fact that I can walk to the corner of my room and press a switch and the lights will go on.
Yes.
99% of the time. I mean, that's kind of amazing.
It is. And still, I think the level of self-awareness needed to realize first to know what our need is. Because very often I recognize in myself, suddenly I get angry or I'm disappointed or I'm sad, and then to really sit down and think, okay, so what is this telling me? What do I need? Instead of grabbing the bottle of wine and thinking, oh, everything is good right now, and forgetting about the need.
Yes, and worse, when our needs are not being met, we tend to behave in ways that are least likely to get our needs met.
Yeah. So I think to acknowledge that this is a process that needs time, especially when we have to enroll people who might not, who are not facilitators, who are not in our bubble where we spend lifetime and money on self-awareness and
Yes,
personal
and when we
development.
look at, you know, look at workplaces, for example, you know, which is, it's become a big focus for me. You know, the way that the people in boardrooms and at senior management levels look at things, you know, it's not going to, you know, people aren't going to work to meet the same needs when they're on minimum wage. And there has to be some kind of understanding or dialogue around that.
Yeah, which then connects to the values of a company, that it's more than just writing them on the boardroom walls.
Oh, I've walked into a school once, and there was all these multicolored posters with, you know, these are our values, and I took one look and they were everywhere, and I just said, oh, this is really amazing. How did you come up with these values? Like, you know, if you truly have these values and you're living by them, you don't really need me. You've done the work. And I was told a temporary head teacher came in. The school went into what's called special measures. So a temporary head teacher came in and just wrote it and had them printed and stuck them and told everyone these are our values.
It's painful and sad and
So
sad.
it's just,
Yeah.
but that has just such a lack of awareness.
Yeah.
And so everybody was just walking around laughing at it and being offended by it.
And it's interesting, and it sounds so silly to hear it from a school. And at the same time, I would not be surprised if in a different shape or form, the same is actually true in companies. Then maybe it wasn't the one head teacher, but maybe it was the one consultant
Yes.
who came up with that, or who a board meeting where they came up with that without having co-created it or applied it to the company.
Yes. And so for me, you know, you can definitely run things in a hierarchical way and you can get things done. But I challenge the sustainability of that.
Yeah.
And when you use what I call ground up empowerment, you're going to build something much more sustainable and much more solid, and you're going to have a lot more retention, and people are going to be a lot more interested, because when people are not interested, you know, they will come to work. I mean, we've got this phrase going around now, quiet quitting, where people are not, you know, not really doing the work, you know. And so people won't share their knowledge. But, you know, the person who sweeps the sawdust off the factory floor knows so much more than many other people about the workings of the business. But if they're only treated as someone who sweeps the sawdust and nobody's interested, they'll never share what they have to share. And so the people further up have to shoulder more and more and more responsibility, and then you get burnout.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you're saying that. I also believe that there's so much wisdom and knowledge in an organization that is never tapped into,
Yes. Yeah.
because the different people are not asked, and because it's very, I think the complexity is lies not necessarily in the asking, but then by asking you somehow create expectations and create a complexity that you have so much data then and so many perspectives, and then what are you doing with that? And I think the awareness or the fear of not meeting expectations and having all these different perspectives hold many back of actually doing the work.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. People are, I mean, who wants to stick their neck out? Who wants to put their head above the parapet? You know, for many people, it's just as well to go in, do a good enough job to get a decent appraisal and keep your head below the surface.
And on the other hand, I'm thinking back of what you said about walking the streets in London, talking to the people. And when I ask you what motivated them to be in a conversation with you, they observe what's going on in their streets and they are affected by it and they want to change. And then I'm just thinking, obviously, in the corridors of most organizations, people are not shot. And still, we observe these toxic cultures, behaviors that are not good for us. We observe all the burnouts and silent quitting. So we are affected. So what does it take to contribute to the change? So
Well,
where
it's an interesting thing, because when I heard you say people are not shot, I thought, no, it's worse. They're experiencing a very slow, torturous, painful death. You know, because what you can create is nice dead people.
Mm. Yeah, and then the question is, what would it take to apply similar methods that you apply to the streets of London? to the corridors of corporate.
Oh, absolutely. And that's that's where my focus is going now, is looking at people with line management responsibility and helping them to see it differently, to see that just because you've got line management responsibility, you're not a police officer. You do not have to be a detective. You're not hired as an enforcer. You're hired to help people meet the standards required and meet the terms of their contract in a way that creates the least amount of unnecessary human suffering.
So where are the similarities and the differences when you get a workforce or corporates into the room as opposed to neighbors?
So, well, when we talk about neighbours, I'm particularly talking about social housing. And so it's a really interesting thing, because when I'm working in communities, it's financial poverty, economic poverty, economic injustice. And that creates a desperation, a level of desperation. When I'm working in businesses where, profitable businesses, not where it's, whatever, and I do work in a few profitable businesses, the pressure is not economic, but it moves to time. So the same poverty mentality exists. It's just manifested very differently.
And it's very interesting because the idea or the sensation of scarcity does something to our brain and creates stress in our nervous system that leads to certain behaviors that are definitely not healthy. And yes, it's true, whether it's a scarcity in money or in time, it might have the same effect on our primal system.
It definitely affects the nervous system. The nervous system becomes too hyper alert, too stressed, and that stress creates, then we're not who we really are when we're in that state. And the trouble is, it's very addictive. Once people are in that state, firstly, they incrementally got there. So the same with the gangs, they've incrementally become hyper vigilant, tense, stressed, everything's dangerous, and in the corporate corridors, the same thing. But you don't see yourself changing. It's incremental. You don't see, only other people see how far you've changed from where you were. And the trouble with that is, first we have to have awareness. That's what this whole mindfulness thing was about. And then we have to take conscious steps to calm the nervous system right down. And then you start to realize how you've been seeing the world, how you've been judging people, how you've been experiencing everything that could have been so different. I did a training just yesterday, and in one of the go arounds, someone said, I'm having a distressed moment because I'm suddenly looking back at situations that didn't need to be the way they were if I'd known this.
And it's, as you say, it can go so fast. When I'm thinking back of the person I was before the summer vacation, I was angry at everyone. When I was cycling my bicycle in the street, I was angry at everyone who dared to get into my way in public streets. And I had a few kind of quite apologetic meetings with my team members because I was not myself, because I was in time scarcity. Totally stressed and not myself. And yeah, this can happen even to self-aware, usually regulated.
Yeah, I mean, this work and doing this work has been so good for me, because obviously if I want to do this work, I actually need to live it. So I have to have my own practices. But, you know, stripped away from that and who I used to be, you know, everything and everyone annoys me. You know. Yeah. So it's been this really lovely journey of curiosity and knowing that talking to you is part of me, and I'm meeting myself and you're meeting yourself, and we're trying to figure out what we can do together.
Yeah.
You know, for this 2 minutes. You know, so it's that thing about, you know, not overlooking the woman at the checkout, for example. You know, the person at the checkout. That's an encounter.
Yeah.
There's
And
a
then,
richness in it, isn't there's a richness in just looking someone in the eye and saying, I hope you're having an okay day.
yeah. Yeah, which also helps us in our nervous system. If we just smile at people
I
randomly in the
remember
street, we feel better.
when my mum died in 2017, but in the lead up to that, there were a lot of hospital visits and, you know, to the emergency room, etc. And I remember we were sitting in accident and emergency for 12 hours. I mean, literally 12 hours. And I started to recognise how upset I was getting. And I just thought, well, I haven't got the power to change anything here, but I could change my attitude.
Mm.
And so the next time a nurse came, I just looked at the nurse and said, you know, when you did your training and when you've thought about becoming a nurse, I bet it never occurred to you that you wouldn't have the necessary resources to do your job. And that person just broke down. Like, not badly, but just, you know, was welled up. And I was able to give them a hug and say, you're doing the best you can.
Mm.
The problems are with a bigger system, and in this moment, no one can fix that. And there was something about doing that. It didn't change anything. It just changed the energy around how we all were together.
Yes, and it reminds me of what you said about the needs-based theory, that very often one of our basic needs is to be seen in
Yeah,
our reality, and what
yeah,
and
yeah,
then this leads not feeling seen, not feeling heard, not feeling recognized, that we are
yeah,
trying to do our best. This leads to anger and
yeah,
despair and all of that. So very often we don't need to do much, but to see and to acknowledge.
yeah. And to remember that we've all got something going on, you know.
Yeah. And
And then there's a time for action, you know. So my work is energetic, and it's about healing, and it's about seeing each other and understanding. And then there's a time to do.
yeah. And I do get the doing part. And I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you mean by, because I have my interpretation of what it means to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the impression that what used to be considered as woo-woo nowadays becomes very real.
Yes.
But then there's still woo-woo way of talking about it, and there's more
Yes.
kind of real world way of talking about it. So when you
Yes.
talk about healing,
Yes.
what do you mean?
So I'll put it like this, because I mean, you know, it's a very deep subject.
Mm.
What I'll talk about is no matter how amazing our families were or whatever, there were definitely, nobody could get 100% fantastic, loving, nurtured attention 100% of the time. And so there will be needs as children that were not met, not intentionally, sometimes intentionally, you know, sometimes definitely, sometimes environmentally, but there will be needs that never got met. And when those needs didn't get met, we had to adapt. And sometimes that's a maladaptation. And that's so what we call personalities for me is just the masks I had to put on to find my way in the world to become acceptable,
Mm.
to either to survive or to flourish. And so it's good in adulthood to go back and then to recognize that there are things I took on, ways of being in the world, whether that's, I'm just going through something at the moment of recognizing that in my mother's traumatized state, she often said, I never wanted children. I never wanted children. I never wanted children. That was something I grew up with. And I'm realizing that being of service and giving service has been a way of making my life mean something.
Because you weren't wanted, or the
air
quotes, that was the sensation.
Yeah, so I'm just, and so it's about looking at the reasons that we've taken our lives in the directions from a place of a lack of consciousness. And of course, some of us take and do things that are actually really wonderful for the world, and we're giving and all the rest of it. And some people go on a different path that has injury, loss, or harm built into it. And so for me, healing is about this understanding that there is a connection to something bigger and greater, God, the universe. And I have a name for it, I call it the pipeline of self-love. And so the pipeline of self-love is free, it exists, it's 24/7, no one can take it away from me, but the choices I make, the way I choose to think and the things I choose to do either keep me in it or take me out of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Is that
makes total sense? And somehow an image came to my mind when I listened to you, and you speaking about the masks to mask our wounds or harms, or and if these masks are sort of band-aids that we put on in order because something has hurt in the past. And then the healing is basically the opportunity to put off these masks to show who we really are. So we can,
and that's the vulnerability, isn't it? That's the vulnerability. Yeah. So, I know that when I was, 17, I went into a very male orientated workplace, and, back then we expected sexual harassment, you were dodging those bullets, and so because I was a young girl in a man's world, but I was also ambitious, and I also kind of felt I was better than the perception of me. I developed this very emphatic way of talking, this way of like, if you talk to me, you're going to get it straight between the eyes. And, it served me to get me through. And on the other hand, it hardened me in some way. So, it became part of my personality. And it's just really wonderful to have that awareness and go, wow, so this work, I'm not just being of service, I'm also healing myself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how to recognize that our strategies that brought us so far, suddenly, I have that with, I had the life sentence, air quote, I have to work, that I started as a kid because my parents always fought over money. So there was always scarcity. And very early on, I put the thought in my head, I have to work. I have to be independent. I have to earn my own. And then realizing I'm working myself to death if I don't stop that. And then not being able to relax or to just enjoy private life because I have to work. So yeah, this is one of those. It has served me, it brought me financial independence and everything, but now it doesn't serve me anymore. And that's hard, and that's hard work, and that's healing, because it's painful to change
and
that
knowing
behavior.
When a strategy has run its course.
Yeah,
that's the point, where what you perfectly described was, although it was painful, you understood, now that's run its course.
Yeah. Mm. And then to create and hold the space to acknowledge that.
Mm.
And I find it beautiful, and I have lots of respect for that, to create the space, not for the deep trauma and therapy work, but at least to create this acknowledgement and empathy for that, so that it can be seen in the workplace.
It needs to be seen, because that's another problem. I mean, in a lot of places, you daren't tell your manager, I slept really badly, or I'm having a bad day, or whatever, because within some systems, someone's going to write that down and it's going to go against you at some point. Just because I want to tell you that I'm not 100% today doesn't mean I'm not going to be able to do my job.
Yeah. And I think that this is something that I realized only recently. We all talk about we need to be vulnerable and talk about our feelings. Yes, that's great. But the one reason why we usually don't is because either it will be used against us or we will be manipulated.
Absolutely. I mean, to tell people we need to be vulnerable, I mean, the only place to be vulnerable is in a safe space facilitated by somebody who can be trusted.
And then knowing that the trust will also be maintained, or the safety afterwards.
There are systems in our society. I mean, Ofsted is a really good one, because there was a teacher, wasn't there, a year ago or so, who took her own life because her Ofsted judgment was reduced to one word. And there are systems that, if you want to survive, you need political savvy. You need to be able to nimbly navigate around these systems. And I don't blame people for doing that.
Yeah.
But what I would want to look at is, what's the injury, loss, or harm to self, other, or society?
Yeah. Beautiful. What remains your facilitation challenge?
My facilitation challenge is, so I can take this work so far, and it's often very well received. Mostly, I make relationships that endure, and even long after projects have finished, I will be in touch with people, and I love the richness of that. The biggest challenge is that once people have had power over others, and no matter how much they say they would like to give up some of that power, when the chips are down and their back is against the wall, the temptation for them to go back to taking the power becomes greater than I can often hold. And so the most interesting thing for me, I mean, our prison system in the UK is out of control, and everybody's complaining, and and yes, it is bad, and all the rest of it. But the most interesting thing for me was that over the period of 7 years that we have been in Dartmoor prison, I've had the most stretch, the most opening, and the most change to any system there in a prison, in the place where you would think it would be the least likely, because it's a very tough regime. And yet the willingness and the longing of people that run that system to be engaged, and the irresistibility of it, meant that that's probably the place. It's really interesting, isn't it?
It is. And I must say, on my podcast bucket list is an interview with a prison director. To hear their perspective on facilitating collaboration and community within a prison. I think that's a very peculiar context.
Oh,
Mm.
okay. I might be able to help you there.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you. And I can imagine that this is also the place where you may find hope, because it seems as if there is none, but as a survival mechanism.
So I'm delighted by what's happened in the prison, and there are other places. There are other places, and that was your question. Hang on, let's. Okay, so let me answer that again. So your question was about where are the challenges, and that is the greatest challenge, that people who have power, when their back is against the wall, will then go to claim the power back. And how do you hold someone through the fear and the of course, because when you let go of power, when you go for power sharing, so not having power over, but you go for power sharing, often the reason you took power was because you don't feel safe.
Yeah.
Taking power is rooted in control and safety and avoiding disappointment. It's rooted in all that. So when we say, like, you're going to give up some of that power in order to be able to not take all the responsibility and to have community, a person's got to face all their biggest fears. They've got to. They're going to come face to face with their biggest fears.
Yeah.
So of maybe there will be disappointment. Maybe it won't work the way you thought, and we go through these tunnels to find a different light.
Yeah.
And so there are places, where I really love to bring this work. There's a particular, in fact, I'm actually going to name them. I mean, there's a famous chef called Yotam Ottolenghi in the UK, and the chain of restaurants of Ottolenghi. And, if you walk into that business, the compassion and the care and the seeing of staff members means that when I come to do the work I'm doing, it's perfectly natural. I'm not saying they're a business, they need to make a profit. They need to, business needs to function, and people need to do the things they want to do. But the way I talk about, there's a time for talking, there's a time for action, fits so perfectly.
Yeah.
And so what I'm doing there is I'm training managers in how to manage from a compassionate, facilitative standpoint, to see themselves as people who enable their team to get their work done, not as enforcers and detectives, which makes life very miserable.
And it's interesting that you describe the context of a professional kitchen, because I think most kitchens would operate in a command and control way, where you have to give very clear orders, and there is no space for compassion or for anything human, because it has to work like clockwork. And then now to hear you that it is possible.
Oh, it's absolutely possible. And that is about the dialogue. So, during service, everyone needs to play their role, right? If you're on that business's time, and as long as the training is in place and everybody understands, then whatever. But things will go wrong. We're all human. Stuff will happen. And it's about how we talk about that afterwards. So you'll never change the system in the middle of an incident. In the middle of an incident, all you can do is get back to safety. That's all you can do. What's necessary, not just for the system, but to get everybody back to safety.
Yeah.
If you actually then discover that the system doesn't work, you need to create specific spaces to change that system when there are no pressures.
Yeah. You never change a system in the middle of an incident. Yes.
No, and that's what we keep trying to do. We keep trying to give people instructions when they're in shock, in a pressure cooker, made a mistake, probably feeling shame. You know, in the middle of all that, we think we can instruct people to change. All we can do is take the necessary steps to de-escalate, to not let things get worse, to find some humanity and get back to what we need to finish.
Amen. Close off. I started to enjoy asking the question, what is it that you would have loved to have known before when you just got started with all the work?
What would I have loved to know?
Or what's the advice you would give someone? You'd give yourself?
The advice that I would like to have had, or what I would have liked to have known going in, and what I would like people to know going in, is that when we're working with other people, we are going on a journey, and you will only ever be able to be as good as the depth of the work that you've done, right? You're only ever, so when you hit up against boundaries and you find yourself stuck and you don't know how to manage, it's not the fault of your participants. It's you're going to have to take that into supervision and into your own journey. And if you don't do that, and if you don't understand that this is as much you undoing yourself, then what you're in danger of doing is using people as your personal theatre to watch everybody else struggle so you can pretend it isn't you, and hope that you can do something magically that will help them heal so you can watch it and hope it rubs off on you and you don't actually have to do the work yourself.
Thank you. Beautifully said. Feels like a mic dropping moment. Thank you, Maria, for this rich conversation and inviting us into different areas of facilitation that I think many of us have not had the chance to experience and learn from.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been really lovely. And I feel very seen by you on some level, like very nurtured.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'd love, if there's other opportunities